Hello and welcome to another episode of In Plain English, the podcast where we make science approachable, open source, and jargon-free. I am your host, Jamie Moffa, and we are coming back from our lovely little summer break with a fun episode that I recorded at a board game convention called Gen Con this past August. I sat down with James Reed of Science Night, as well as my friend Mara Leiden and my partner Max at the very end, to talk about science in board games, science fiction, all of that good nerdy stuff, bringing together the, hard science of it all with the fun board games and RPGs and video games that we all like to play in our free time. I also have one quick announcement before we get into the episode. In Plain English is looking for guests, both guests who are experts in a particular field of research or non-expert guests who just love science and want to be a part of the show by being the person who asks questions and engages with the material and pushes our experts to explain things in a way that people will actually understand. So please, if you are interested in being either an expert or a non-expert guest on the podcast, you can reach out either via the Continue the Conversation tab on the website, or you can send me an email at inplainenglishpod@gmail.com. I hope that you enjoyed this conversation. It goes a lot of different places, and we'll be back next month with another full episode of In Plain English. I'm here hanging out at Gen Con with James Reed. James, how are you doing?
I'm doing pretty good. Last night we got to talk about some science fiction, talk about Fallout. Steffi horrified everybody by showing just how dead we would all be.
Yeah, very dead.
With the nuclear blast. So that was fun.
Question mark? Yeah.
It was an experience. I feel like we all left with a healthy mistrust of corporate America.
Yeah, I actually really enjoyed that part of the talk that you were kind of cosplaying as a company called Vault-Tec.
Yeah.
Who was trying to unethically put people into vaults for science ?
Yeah, I wanted to talk, because we never talk about we often don't talk about the nitty gritty stuff with science. So I wanted to find a way to talk about the Institutional Review Board, IRB.
Yeah.
And I was like, it's going to be the most boring thing in the world if I make this an IRB continuing education training.
Right, the IRB.
Yeah.
Actually, for the folks at home, what is the IRB?
The IRB is basically the way that science with a big capital S has tried to avoid some of our biggest missteps in the past. So we're talking about the Tuskegee syphilis experiment. We're talking about anything where people are being experimented on without their consent and without their knowledge of that. So IRB is specifically relating to when we're doing any kind of research that involves living people. People is the big thing that goes there.
There's a different animal one.
There's different, IACUC, which is an acronym.
Yes, it is.
I don't know what it stands for.
Institutional Animal Care and Use Committee.
Yeah.
Because I am an animal researcher.
And it's way more strict. It's way more strict because you cannot get informed consent from an animal. So you can do some wild things to people if you can prove to your IRB committee that you are not coercing anybody and that it is as ethical as we can do it.
Right. And there's the rub. As ethical as we can do it. Because there's in psychology, this is really fascinating. There's a lot of experiments that involve straight up lying to people.
Yes, absolutely.
Because you have to make them think that you're not testing what you're testing, because otherwise they'll think about it and they'll do something other than what they normally would have done.
Sure. Well, it even goes difference when we're talking across cultures. I was talking to a medical anthropologist that was working with a Tibetan population in China, and they were testing Eastern medicine. Mm-hmm. Specifically, they were testing a postpartum herbal remedy for uterine bleeding. That is proven to be as effective as the Western pharmaceutical.
Oh, neat.
With less blood pressure implications.
Yeah.
which postpartum blood pressure is
Very
like a
important.
thing you need to
Yeah.
really worry about. But to get IRB approval, because they wanted it to be published in Western journals, because people in China are already using this.
Right. They don't need to be told. They know.
Yeah, so they had to get IRB approval, and they had to come up with all of these things that just don't mesh well in that culture. The idea of a placebo is something that is not
They're like, why would we not use something that we know works?
Yeah, and the idea that they had to still use an herbal remedy that was a placebo. And then there's like an entire spiritual component that they were trying to work around as well.
Yeah.
So there was like, they got the IRB approval, but there's all these extra steps on top of just the ethical considerations that sometimes IRB has a blind spot to. But I still think as a system, it's pretty good.
Overall, we'd rather have people like whose job it is to think about whether or not we're being ethical as scientists than just letting people go off and do their own thing.
Yeah.
Because sometimes that goes really badly.
Well, and the big thing about the makeup of a review board is that there is always a layperson on it. So there's a non-scientist that we have to go and be like, I promise this is worth it. And sometimes it's good to have the non-scientist to be like, is it?
Is it really?
And then when you get into like specific communities, usually you'll have representatives from that community involved too. So we're trying sometimes. But there's always horror stories coming out every year.
That's always a challenge when it comes to talking about science with the general public. Because like on the one hand, you want to be very transparent about how science operates. And on the other hand, like all they hear all the time, I feel like, is just like, holy shit, the scientist just did something really unethical and it's all over the news.
Yeah.
My friend Mara has just joined us. Mara and I do and a whole bunch of our friends do a Spire podcast, which is a tabletop role-playing game where you are revolutionary dark elves who are trying to take back your city of Spire from the Aelfir high elf colonizers.
The dark elf proletariat.
Yes, it's really good.
Revolutionary architecture and journalism going hand in hand. Oh man.
Revolutionary architecture?
Yeah.
What's that?
Anything that is of the people, right? Brutalism is revolutionary architecture. Can be.
Depends. See, this is interesting because I feel like whether or not architecture is revolutionary depends on like who's using it.
It depends on the revolution. Too.
Yeah, also
It depends on
that.
the revolution.
Yeah.
I don't know if enough about the history of brutalism to dispute this.
Yeah.
I just personally don't like brutalism.
So it was definitely co-opted by America to make things cheaply.
Yeah.
Instead of
Instead of paying for windows.
Make things
who
cheaply
needs those?
for a profit, I should say.
Right.
Instead of
Make things cheaply so that you can put more people in houses.
Yeah.
So I think there's an American connotation that is anti-brutalism because it's not very good looking and also still expensive.
Yeah.
So
Right. So you're like, why did we do that?
yeah. Whereas if you can make like decent housing for 18,000 people quickly, and then also charge them not very much or nothing,
Right.
that's a good thing.
Yes.
Their souls just die. That's fine. We don't need those.
There's some other things we can work on too.
Right. We could make things that look nice but also don't cost $1 million.
Sure.
You know what was really cool? So the very first game that I ever played with Mara was a solar punk game.
Okay.
Basically where we were like kind of sort of explorers on a new planet, but the whole like system was set up so that you're like guaranteed housing and everything's green and it's very like, you know.
We've conquered fission.
We've conquered fission, we can do. But like I do love
everything else.
No, I do love. We were talking. Actually, that ties nicely back into the Science Night Science Night
fusion.
Panel last night because one of their co-hosts is a fusion nuclear physicist person.
Yeah, she's working. Steffi Dean works on the Pegasus 3 experiment at the University of Wisconsin. Yeah,
Amazing.
It's great. There was a Pegasus 2, I've been told. So they're really going on. Oh my gosh, there's like a story behind it too where the experiment before the Pegasus was another Greek thing, but it was basically because that PI wanted to name something Pegasus. So it was like something else
Makes
for
sense.
that. Yeah.
So can we have solar punk without having fusion? Because fusion is perpetually 10 years away.
So that's hard. You know what solar punk is?
Yeah. I mean, you can do whatever you want in a fictional setting where you don't have to worry about solar sprawl, right?
Yeah.
The idea behind solar punk, solar, isn't it?
Yeah.
Of course, that technology is also ever expanding, and like we keep learning more problems about colonization and solar power and battery. But on in my opinion, a diversified power source is the only way to do it. So my pet project is like wave power. Mm-hmm. So the generators are always going because the waves are always going. The only problem is that people have said to me is that like obviously corrosion is an issue with systems like that. But
with salt water.
Yeah, salt water is hard. But that's what I think our best bet is because the wind is not always blowing and the sun is not always shining. But the waves, those will stop.
Waving.
The waves are always waving at you.
Until they don't, and that's a bigger problem.
That's a bigger problem.
We have lots of issues.
Ocean currents are a bigger problem.
Yeah.
So that was we talked about that on a podcast episode. There's a Japanese deep current generator that was movable, so it could like crawl on its little wheels and keep up with the current. But
Strand beast, but deep sea.
Yeah, the problem is then transportation of the energy. So like we have the ability to move with the deep current. We have renewable energy. We have this giant monstrosity of a machine on the seafloor, so it's not viewable by every NIMBY that doesn't want to see a solar array.
Yep.
But then we need to have like a 500-mile wire to get it to any meaningful grid.
And that's inefficient.
And cost-specific wires already exist is mind-blowing. That kind of international cooperation is just necessary to prevent climate change from completely destroying our entire planet. Don't see that happening anytime soon either.
This is a wild time.
No.
The post World War II area was.
It was a heyday in some respects. In other respects, it was not good. But that actually, I would kind of be interested to talk about a fun little game that I've played a couple times called Daybreak.
Okay.
Have you heard of it?
I have not heard of it. Tell me all about it.
It's amazing, and it works really, really well with science in gaming because it is kind of a Pandemic. It's actually by one of the same designers as Pandemic, but you are cooperatively working together to stop climate change. And so you're playing.
I'm on board.
There are 4 different factions that you can play. One of them is the U.S., one is Europe, one is China, and one is everybody else. It's called Global Majority, but it's basically like everyone who's not those other 3 categories. And you each have like different abilities and you draw cards that help you sequester carbon, but at the same time, you're all producing a bunch of carbon because it kind of starts out like with the world state as it was in maybe like 1970. And the first round kind of brings us up to today in terms of carbon emissions. So you start out emitting a ton of carbon. And then throughout the game, you are working together to be able to use your different cards and abilities to reduce your carbon emissions, sequester carbon, and get the world to the point where it is no longer spewing CO2 into the atmosphere.
Do we deal with like unaltered effects, like the fact that we have already changed the climate?
So I think that's where the first round of the game basically gets us to the current state. So by round 1, it's basically impossible not to have 1.5 C of warming. Right. So that kind of deals with that. The end game, I don't think deals with like there's some
sequestration.
There's like 1 or 2 cards that let you do that, but they're actually pretty rare, and the game more focuses on like the renewable energy and social sides of being able to combat climate change. But like,
my question, does it deal with adaptation?
So we're going to evolve to a hardier people?
Yeah, well, not necessarily like physical adaptation, but like building underground and stuff.
Oh, okay.
Ways that humans have already dealt with climate change. This is the biggest thing for me, is that we're already at 1.5 C's of warming, and we've probably locked in 2. The world that our children inherit needs to be able to withstand that.
So not as much. It kind of abstracts that into a concept of like social and social, ecological, and infrastructure resilience, which you can use cards. And I think those cards do have some like actual suggestions of how the world can be more resilient. But basically you play cards to get yourself more social or ecological or infrastructure resilience. But I think that's the most abstracted portion of the game. It's less concerned about that and more concerned about the actual, like, how would we
stop emitting carbon?
How would we get, the end game is basically getting to net zero. The problem, So the problem is like, that's only half the problem, and it's still really hard, and it's assuming that everybody wants to work together.
Yeah.
Does it also assume like a steady population?
Right.
It doesn't, so actually...
Or population decline or population anything?
So the one mechanic of the game is that every round you have to add... It represents the population by more houses that you have to houses.
My question: does it separate houses by global majority?
The global majority adds 3 houses every turn. Yeah. I think China adds 2, and Europe and the US add 1. So
that is wrong, though, because the fact of the matter is every person born in America uses instantly upon their birth 26 times more energy and carbon emissions than someone born in like Senegal.
The way that it balances this out is that it's way easier for global majority to cancel out that housing increase. So the couple games that I've played, the global majority gets to the point where it is not emitting any carbon from population faster than the US or Europe, even though they have more houses, they have more like population to cover. They actually have an easier time canceling out those emissions.
I mean, that's true. So like, I feel like that's probably a little bit more accurate. Of course, it's a game you have to abstract a bunch of mechanics. These are just things that like, I feel like especially American game designers don't deal with. And the fact of the matter is, when I was in school taking climate classes, it was all about how, oh my God, there's too many billion people on the earth. We're all going to perish. And it's like, no, it's actually, the earth already produces enough food to feed 10 billion people. Mm-hmm. Capitalism is the problem.
Yeah.
Sure. Yeah.
It's actually very funny. I literally today got an email on my podcast about this with someone being like, stop saying that the world is on the right track. I don't know when I ever said that, but they're basically like trying to push this like overpopulation theory of climate change.
Yeah, it's 20 years out of date.
Right.
At least. And people like global minority people, like scientists who have been studying this, being new, that this is not something that like is dealt with equitably. I mean, countries like India, literally the most populous country in the world, they produce more carbon right now. And basically India is saying it's not fair that you guys got to industrialize and emit all this carbon before us. And now you're yelling at us for emitting this much carbon and burning all this coal. Well, we have a giant population that deserves to have the same quality of life as yours.
Yeah. And they're not wrong.
They're
totally not wrong.
Yeah.
The way that it's interesting, so the mechanic I just described in the game where the global majority faction has an easier time building up its renewable energy, actually it does, when you're playing them, a little bit feel like you are carrying the world's green energy production for the first like 2 or 3 turns of the game, which is definitely an interesting, like in light of what you were just saying, right, that like that's not actually very equitable. It is interesting, but it's also treating like 1 unit of green energy as the same as 1 unit of dirty energy, when like it actually takes a lot more technology and infrastructure to produce the green energy. So I don't think the game deals very well with that disparity.
Yeah, it's interesting. I find it really interesting, the biases, especially that we build into our board games, especially when it comes to like really thorny, complicated topics like climate change. I mean, that's the reason I'll never play Terraforming Mars. You play as a corporation, it was Terraforming Mars.
Right.
And it's all about corporate expansion and like espionage.
So we had actually talked to not many, a couple game makers, just to kind of see like when they're talking about either social or scientific concepts of any kind, if they're including either the affected communities or some kind of scientists. And Often they're not.
Yeah.
There were, and it's always going to be better when they're including scientists because
Right.
they're like, oh, this is science. We have people.
Yeah.
But when they're talking about the real lived experience of minority communities, it's very rarely. And I think the only time we got like oh yes, we have an entire group that we run our mechanics through before we're even into the design. It was a minority-owned company.
Yeah.
So totally makes sense.
I mean, if you haven't checked it out yet, there's a booth here at Gen Con called Burn Down the Fort.
Okay.
And it's done by indigenous designers, and it's all about like attacking the settlers before they can get to the fort and kill all of your people. And they can like there's a center deck of colonizer cards that do things like inflict a treaty, which breaks your alliances with the other indigenous players, and you like play as a different like significant historical figure from indigenous history. And you can form alliances with each other, but you don't attack each other. Like you just try and burn down this fort.
Oh, I see. I like it.
The design looked really clever. I'm excited to play it, but also like you said, that game could only have been made by someone who was already from the community.
Yeah. I mean, that's like it's a concept that like a European-based company is just not going to come up with.
Nope.
They're never going to think of making something like that because they haven't had to live through 300 years of marginalization.
Yep. Well, one of my favorite mechanics of the game is that there's a dice rolling mechanic, but it sticks.
Okay.
And so, like, it gives you a scoring point for each of these 3 sticks. It's like rolling d6s, but like throwing sticks as part of a dice game is much more of an American indigenous tradition.
Absolutely.
And so, like, from the ground up, reimagining how we play games and what cultures are centered in the very rules mechanics makeup of the game. I found that really fascinating, and I find it really interesting how mechanics and like the biases that you build into the core of the game are going to affect gameplay and what you come away with.
Sure. Yeah. That's so interesting. I would love to see what they would want to do with like some of the Asian conceptions of Native Americans and really kind of turn that on their head.
Yeah.
There's a fun role-playing game that I've run a couple of sessions of that kind of does that. It's called Coyote and Crow.
Okay. I'm writing all these down. Yeah.
Yes. There are a couple of sessions running at Gen Con. Actually, I think there are more this year than there were last year. But it is a role-playing game set in an alternative future where Europeans did not colonize the Americas. Instead, a magic meteor hit Earth and gave people the ability to have like supernatural powers, basically, which I've been told is kind of a trope. Not just people, also animals and plants. Yeah. That's actually where the people get it from, is that originally this like power transferred to animals and plants, and then the like indigenous people of the Americas, which North America is called Makasing in this thing, because obviously there was no Americo Vespucci, I think, to come like colonize it. So it's called Makasing, and the peoples discover how to use this like supernatural power that's embedded in animals and plants to give themselves like supernatural enhancements. So what I really enjoy about it is that now you're playing in like, I think it's around
700 years after
like 2100. Yeah.
So like 700 years after like the meteor hit, like just before Columbus left, basically.
Yeah.
And put the Earth into another ice age. And now you are playing 700 years later in its cultural renaissance as the world comes out of this like age of darkness.
Yeah. And so it blends the magical elements of this meteor with a lot of really cool technology elements. So you have like personal like flying vehicles that are called sun wings. You have like lots of
No wheels.
No wheels.
No wheels.
Yeah.
You have lots of augmented tech, like you can augment your own player character with like, you know, you can have like augmented reality glasses, you can have like cybernetic arms, you can have like brain implants, but it's a really interesting blend of like magical / supernatural elements, indigenous culture and heritage, and like really neat futuristic technology.
Sure. Yeah, so it's like a Native American take on like an Afrofuturism.
Yeah. That's what it reminds me of a little bit.
Yeah, I'm definitely seeing like some Black Panther crossover, which is a good thing, you know, because if you do it right, you know.
Yeah.
Because if you can I think it's always okay if you include the community in the representing the far future version of this community, right? Because you don't want to be like, we're gonna make laser tomahawks, which I could see would be an easy thing to pull. Yeah. So this seems really cool. I'm gonna go and check out as much of the stuff as I can.
Yeah.
It's really interesting that the couple of times that I've run games of Coyote and Crow, when I initially talk about it, a lot of people, and like share the rule book with people, a lot of people think like, this world seems pretty like utopian. What are we going to do? Like, what are the problems? Mm-hmm. And then like we play the game and they're like, oh, wow, there was like, it was so rich. There was so much depth there. Sure. So I think it's really funny that I've played mostly with other white people, although this past time I played with a couple of people who are from like indigenous communities in Central and South America. Mm-hmm. But it's really, those comments all came from like white people. And I think it's really interesting that we can't conceive of like how we would have stories or problems or plots without like the fucked up way that we have specifically messed with the world.
And that's always the problem when we try to go too far as like people of European descent that are gonna try and be like, all right, we're gonna highlight this community, and we try to make them be like the idealized version.
Yeah, what's the noble savage?
Exactly.
That's the trope.
Exactly. Yeah. So all the communities are asking for is to be treated as people.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's all they want.
With their own complicated histories and prejudices.
Exactly. Yeah. And their own problems. Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. There are definitely problems in the world of Coyote and Crow. It is not a utopia. It just doesn't have the same kinds of problems that we have. Yeah.
There's definitely problems when you look at, ancient Native American civilizations as well, right?
Oh, yeah.
I think, working with those descendant communities, like, so I'm as a professional, I work at Dartmouth College, but I don't work in the Native American Studies or the archaeology department. But I work with a lot of people who do. Mm-hmm. And one of the things in our area is working with Native American communities who are not necessarily descendant from the ancient peoples that were in that area. They had moved in post glacial maximum. Yeah. So in New England, we have a big glacial lake called Lake Hitchcock, which glaciers receded, Lake Hitchcock drained dramatically in a series of hours, which I would not want to be there.
No.
If you go at the shoreline of glacial Lake Hitchcock, you see all of these stoneworks. Some are megalithic, some are just paths.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And the working hypothesis between both people of European descent and current native communities is that these are colonial constructions. Archaeologists in that area are arguing that why would colonial constructions be way up in the mountains at an area that just happened to be the shoreline or right above it at that point. So, we're trying to, we can't go to a native community and say like, this is your heritage and you need to take it this kind of way, because that's just a different kind of bad. So it's like we're trying to kind of establish through folklore. Well, these scientists are trying to establish through folklore and oral history the kind of sacred landscape that we're seeing around there and trying to come together. It's tough. It's tough when no one really wants to look at it, but a couple of scientists who are like, I promise this is important. So games.
Games mean a lot.
They do.
They do. And they like help us kind of think about and understand the world. And
they do.
They're hugely important in archaeology too.
Oh.
We look at games that preserve, and we can learn a little bit about the culture, but we can also look at how games change. Mm-hmm. Now we can look at like Monopoly as an example. Mm-hmm. And it started as robber baron capitalism in Atlantic City. And now it is morphed into corporate capitalism because you get all of the expanded edition. All the monopolies. You can go buy Guy Fieri Monopoly downstairs right now, which I'm kind of thinking about for a gag. Go to Flavortown. You can do the same thing with a Native American game called Chunky, which are stones. It's a stones and stick game. You can look at these chunky stones, and at a certain era, when there's a lot of kind of like separate polities, like a city-state type system, a lot of independence, they all look really different. There's a lot of individual variation. And then you have this like bigger Mississippian culture out of Cahokia getting larger and larger and larger, and more empirical. And nope, that's not the word. More of an empire.
I was going to say empirical, not that.
More
Imperial.
Imperial.
Uh-huh.
Exerting its control, and you can see that in the commonalities of chunky stones, that they all have the same size, the same shape, but also the same insignia. So it's a way of soft power presentation across the empire. And then you can see at a point where that collapses and they become more diverse again. Yeah. So that's like an interesting thing. So maybe we'll go back to regular old robber baron capitalism monopoly.
Oh no.
Yeah, that's how we can test this hypothesis, right? Is eventually, I mean, now we got monopoly.
I guess what are the social forces that would push, like, that have pushed monopoly towards?
I mean, imperial collapse.
That's what it is.
Yeah.
Which we may be headed towards pretty quickly here.
You know,
we'll see.
We're always just an election away.
Something that was really interesting, I think, for us has been thinking about, like, in Spire, we are playing revolutionary / maybe terrorist cells, and like how that interacts with global politics, and then how you think about like events that are happening in the world when you're playing a game that's portraying these people in a like sympathetic light, right?
Naturally, because you're the protagonists.
Right, yeah. You're like, obviously the cause that we're fighting for is just.
Sure. Yeah. No evil people think they're evil.
Right.
They all think they're the good guy.
Yeah.
I always thought that would be like such an interesting game mechanic where halfway through, you know, you can homebrew this easily, but like for a very large game, it would be hard to pull off. Where halfway through, you find out you're like the evil person. Yeah. And then you have to have like this. You have to have this moment where it's like, do we continue on or do we not do that?
Yeah.
What does that tell about the person who chooses like maybe the easy path of continuing on?
I just read a book called The Light Brigade by Cameron Hurley.
Okay.
That is about a corporate soldier who, like, the conceit is that they have invented light speed travel for physical bodies. Mm-hmm. And so they're like, the soldiers are sent to Mars to fight this interplanetary war at the speed of light. Mm-hmm. But the protagonist begins to experience time incorrectly because of light speed. Yeah. And it's all about breaking free of corporate shackles and like, what do you value as a like human being in a world that hates you? And like, corporate greed is what will destroy the world. Very, very interesting. Very, very loopy. Do love Cameron Hurley's writing.
Have you ever read the entirety of the 3-Body Problem series?
Let's get my partner on here because he has.
I have not.
Good Lord, I'm supposed to be the photographer of this episode, and now I'm supposed to talk on it. Yeah, I read the 3-Body Problem. It has a massive scope understanding of like the future for humanity and a very bleak understanding of the reality of existing in this universe.
Right. So part of the conceit is that, you know, I think it's very late in the series. They do this, humanity discovers faster than light travel.
Yeah.
But the act of traveling faster than light ruptures dimensional space, so that the conceit of traveling faster than light is damaging the universe in an irreparable way. Yeah. So by the time, spoilers, you get to the end of the book and like everything is falling apart.
Yes.
Aren't there only 2 dimensions at the end of the book?
There is one. There is the
whole universe is collapsing in dimensions.
Collapse to one dimension and then the expansion to multiple dimensions.
So they reinvent the Big Bang.
Well, and they also like create these pocket dimensions, right? So we're pulling matter out of the universe. Another conceit where we talk about the ethics of things is like,
and that's how we get bags of holding.
There we go.
They also put some sort of class, maybe not class, but like technological class structure into it because it's very unfair to escape the end of the universe by.
I will say though, if you are going to read this book, the last like 5 chapters, there's so much going on. Yes. It's just like, hey, we need to get to the next Big Bang in 100 pages. Ooh. We got to keep moving.
How do we do it?
So some kind of larger monitoring system, I don't know, weights and measures, but in a galactic scale, intergalactic even, is measuring the amount of mass. And they're like, oh goodness, all these pocket dimensions have taken so much mass out of existence that there will not be a Big Bang and this will be the end unless we all work together to put things in. So then there's like the internal working of who's going to be the first one to do it. And then eventually it does happen. There is a happy ending. In a very bleak trio of books, there is a slightly happy ending. They do all die. But
the universe continues. Interesting.
Yeah, there's so many other things. You should read these books. They're great.
So with his description of it, I didn't think that I would like it. And my reason being, it seems like it's more concerned with trying to write a book about these very complex scientific theories.
It is.
Than trying to write a book that has a plot or people.
It is definitely about explaining some form of physics problem in each book. The first book is basically explaining the three-body problem, which is a planet going around 3 stars.
And how do you because you can't figure out how it's going to move.
Yeah. The solution to the problem is there is no solution and the planet is doomed.
Yay.
So they just want to hightail it out of there, take over Earth. Now this is a 3-body problem fan podcast.
So I guess my question was going to be less about the 3-body problem and more, can you have hard sci-fi that has also
people like both sociological problems and physics problems? This is a challenge. Ursula K. Le Guin, my favorite author ever, once said that science fiction is not about the science, it's about the people. And she was getting back at people like Asimov, who don't care about people and only care about the science. But I think that sociology is science. And it gets back to this idea in academics of between hard and soft science and what is valued in our society.
Yeah, so this is, if my co-host Jason Organ was here, he would tell this story about his time at SLU, where the anthropology department had a T-shirt for fundraising purposes that said, "Anthropology, dangerously close to science." And he thought it was the greatest thing.
I really like that.
Yeah. But the anthropology department thought that was so spiteful to them. So,
It is.
But I think to answer the question, though, it's I think that is the realm of science communication and something we're finally starting to take seriously, of taking all the jargon and stuff that is so hard to understand that it becomes technobabble, your good old Star Trek technobabble, taking that out of it and finding a way that we can tell a story by using science.
I think science communication is hugely important, especially because it's broader cultural mores that determine what is valued in our society. I think we also have to acknowledge that when women became scientists, that field was no longer valued.
Sure.
And so the fact that some fields happen to be dominated by women and that's where the women go and we are going to silo that off and not pay them is that's still a thing that very much happens. And again, that's part of broader cultural mores, and we can tell the story all we want, but if capitalism doesn't value anthropology, the reason it's not valued is because it doesn't contribute to the economy in the same way.
Not anymore. It used to contribute
used to.
That's a whole other problem.
It used to contribute so much to the economy.
Yeah. I think that on that wonderful note, we're going to have to wrap up because Max and I have somewhere to be at too.
Okay.
Yay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all so much for tuning in to this fun episode of In Plain English. Once again, I was chatting with James Reed of Science Night, Mara Leiden, and Max Woolslagle. We will be back next month with a full episode of In Plain English. And just as a reminder, if you would like to be on an episode of In Plain English, either as an expert or as a guest, you can reach out to me at inplainenglishpod@gmail.com or contact me through the website inplainenglishpod.org. Our logo is by the wonderful team at Biographics. That's Jessica Higginbotham, Tania Lintz, and Yolanda Campos. Our music is by Sam Brunwasser. You can find more of his work on SoundCloud at Visuals Now Beats. And finally, be sure to follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram at Plain English Sci so that you never miss an episode or exciting news and updates about In Plain English. Again, that's PlainEnglishSci. Thanks once again for listening, and come back next time for another episode of In Plain English.